Welcome, mystery lovers. In this story, we step into the world of Tommy and Tuppence, a pair whose wit and courage have made them unforgettable. Tell us where in the world you're listening from. It's always a joy to see how far these mysteries travel. If you enjoy these mysteries, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps keep new cases coming. Now then, shall we begin? The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10 with a tone of patient dignity, as though it had been striking the same hour for a century and intended to continue long after the Beresfords were gone. Sunday sunlight slanted through the window of their cottage at Hollow Key, catching the dust motes that danced lazily over the breakfast table. Tuppence had spread the newspaper open beside her teacup. Tommy, half hidden behind his eggs and toast, was reading the sports section with the serenity of a man who had forgotten wars, codes, and conspiracies. "Tommy," she said without looking up, "do you realize that we're becoming frightfully dull?" He turned a page with deliberate calm. "My dear girl, dullness at our age is a sign of moral health." That's what people say just before something happens to them. Superstitious nonsense. We've earned our peace. Tuppence folded the paper, gave him one of her brisk, considering looks, and reached for the post that lay in a haphazard heap on the sideboard. Bills, circulars, and, oh, a letter addressed in handwriting I almost recognize. Tommy glanced up, toast halfway to his mouth. A bill collector with style? It's old. Look, the ink's faded, the paper yellowed at the edges, and the postmark, Bruges. That made him set the toast down. Bruges? She slit the envelope with the butter knife. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice, no signature, just a short line written in firm, slanting script. He's back, the man from Bruges. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a long-extinguished candle. Tommy gave a low whistle. Well, that's economical correspondence. Who, pray, is back? "You know perfectly well who," Tuppence said quietly. "If you don't, you've forgotten more than I thought possible." He frowned, trying to summon the past from the comfortable haze of middle age. "You can't mean that lunatic code case, the courier we never caught." "The very one. The man we only ever knew as the man from Bruges. He betrayed 3 agents and vanished before VE Day." Tommy picked up the letter, studied it, turned it over, even sniffed the paper. No watermark, no address, nothing. Written on a typewriter ribbon that's almost run dry. Whoever sent this wanted us to read it, not trace it. Or they wanted us to panic, he smiled faintly. "You do realize, sweetheart, that our adventures were 40 years ago. If the man's alive, he must be pushing 80. 80 isn't what it used to be," she said grimly. "Besides, ghosts don't age." Tommy leaned back in his chair, balancing it on 2 legs like a schoolboy. "All right, suppose it's genuine. What do you propose to do? Charge off to Belgium with a magnifying glass and a flask of Bovril?" She ignored the jibe and reread the line. "No return address, but the envelope's British. Sent from somewhere near the coast, judging by the dampness of the paper. Someone who knows about Bruges. Someone who wants us involved. Or wants us out of the way. Exactly why we mustn't ignore it." Tommy sighed, set the chair down with a thump, and looked around their tidy sitting room. The floral curtains, the soft tick of the clock, the gentle comfort of years lived safely. "You're longing for trouble. That's what's the matter." "I'm longing for clarity," she retorted. "The past has an inconvenient habit of turning up uninvited." She carried the letter to the writing desk and laid it beside an old photograph of themselves in wartime uniform. In the photo, Tuppence was smiling, jaunty and sharp-eyed. Tommy had that look of eager usefulness that peacetime never quite managed to replace. "Perhaps someone found one of our old case files," he offered. Perhaps, but who knew about the man from Bruges besides us and Colonel Haley? At that name, a faint line appeared between Tommy's brows. Good old Haley. Haven't heard of him in years. "He's still alive, retired to a seaside home in Bournemouth. If anyone might know something, he would." Tommy groaned theatrically. "So the programme is tea with ancient comrades and inquiries into long-dead villains. You do choose lively hobbies." "I choose not to sit about waiting for the next crossword puzzle to give me meaning." She folded the letter and slipped it into her handbag. "Finish your eggs, dear. We're going to Bournemouth after lunch." The conversation might have ended there, but the doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent sound. The post again, surely. Yet when Tommy opened the door, there was no one on the step, only a faint smell of tobacco and a small brown parcel resting against the mat. The handwriting on the label was the same as on the letter. "Now what?" he muttered, bringing it inside. Tuppence untied the string carefully. Inside was a tiny medal, dulled with age, but unmistakably military. A King's Medal for courage in the cause of freedom. On the back, engraved with elegant precision, 2TB for Bruges, 1944. Tommy stared. But that was lost. It vanished after the operation. "Apparently it's been returned," she said, voice low, "and recently polished." The room seemed suddenly colder. Tommy crossed to the window and looked out over the lane. A cat prowled along the hedge. A bicycle leaned idly against the gate. Nothing sinister, but he could not shake the feeling that someone had been standing there moments before. "Well," he said lightly, "if this is a prank, it's a well-researched one." Tuppence's eyes didn't leave the medal. "Tommy, we're not being mocked, we're being reminded." He tried for humour, his old defence. "I should remind whoever it is that we don't do espionage before luncheon." "Don't be flippant. Whoever sent this knows details that were never public, and they've gone to trouble to reach us here. You think that's coincidence?" He looked at her, saw the familiar fire returning to her expression, the one that meant their quiet domesticity had, for better or worse, ended. "All right," he said slowly. "We'll see Haley, but promise me one thing. If he tells us this is all a wild goose chase, we let it drop." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Tommy, dear, you've never yet known me to drop a goose once I've started chasing it." They laughed, and for a moment the air eased. Fritz the cat, named in unpatriotic humour after an old enemy, leapt onto the table and began batting at the medal. Tuppence shooed him away and gathered the relics of breakfast. Domestic sounds resumed, the kettle refilling, plates stacking, the comfortable rustle of ordinary life reclaiming its territory. Yet when she glanced back toward the hall, the letter lay where she'd left it, the faded words stark against the paper. "He's back, the man from Bruges." The phrase seemed almost alive, whispering from the sideboard with a faint taunt. Tommy fetched his coat. "I'll get the car tuned this afternoon. She hasn't forgiven me since our last jaunt." Tuppence nodded absently. "Bring the old trunk down from the attic before we go. I might need to refresh my memory about certain things." He raised an eyebrow. "The famous trunk? Haven't opened it in decades." "All the more reason. I kept our field notes, some maps, the coded diary, the works." "Very well. But mind, if a mouse jumps out, I shall withdraw from the investigation on medical grounds." She allowed herself a smile. "I'll protect you, as usual." When he had gone, Tuppence carried the letter to the hearth and held it close to the flame, not to burn it, but to catch the faintest scent of the paper. There was a trace, something musty, like old seaweed or damp rope. She thought suddenly of docks and tidewater, of a man walking away under the low sky of Bruges, never turning back. The clock struck the half-hour. She started, realizing she'd been standing motionless. With a small, decisive nod, she crossed to the corner where the attic steps folded down. Dust motes fluttered in protest as she climbed, the air thick with old wood and mothballs. The trunk waited beneath the eaves, scarred, brass-bound, labelled "Property of Mrs. T. Beresford, War Office." Kneeling, she pressed the catch. It gave with a tired sigh. Inside lay the relics of a different life, photographs, coded notebooks, maps drawn in fading ink. She lifted a stack of papers and something small rolled free, striking the floor with a metallic clink. She stared. The medal? No, the first one still lay downstairs. This was another, identical in every detail except for the engraving. This one bore the initials GM. Tuppence drew a sharp breath. "Good heavens," she whispered. "He's been here." Behind her, a floorboard creaked as if answering. She turned, heart quickening, but saw only the thin sunlight slanting through the attic window. Downstairs the kettle began to whistle, ordinary and shrill, summoning her back to the safe, bright world below. But as she descended the ladder, the sound seemed distant, half swallowed by memory. The past had knocked, and she had opened the door. Tommy Beresford had never considered himself sentimental, but as he steered their little Morris along the coastal road toward Bournemouth, He couldn't help feeling that the world had grown altogether too quiet for comfort. The war had faded into anecdotes, the adventures into after-dinner stories. Yet now the past had chosen to stir again, rudely, uninvited, and with impeccable timing, just when he'd renewed his golf subscription. Beside him, Tuppence sat primly upright, gloved hands folded over her handbag. Her eyes were fixed ahead, sharp and speculative. The faded medal, now wrapped in a handkerchief, lay between them on the dashboard like a sleeping snake. "It's absurd," Tommy said. "It went missing in 45, presumed melted down with a dozen others in the depot fire. Yet here it is, turning up in our post as though the universe ran a lost-and-found department for secret agents." Tuppence didn't answer. "You remember the mission report, Tommy? The last person to handle that medal before it vanished was our courier in Bruges. Fellow named Gorman, wasn't it?" Her lips tightened. "Gorman, yes. And Gorman was the man from Bruges." Tommy gave a low whistle. "You think he's still alive after all this time?" "I think someone wants us to believe he is." They drove on in silence, the rhythm of the tyres marking time against the cliffs. The sea glittered below in indifferent sunlight, as though mocking their seriousness. When at last they reached Bournemouth, they found Colonel Haley's care home tucked behind a row of cypress trees, a respectable institution that tried very hard not to look funereal. Inside, a nurse with a cap, starched to moral perfection, led them through a corridor smelling faintly of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. "The Colonel doesn't get many visitors," she said softly. "He'll be delighted to see old friends." Delighted was not the word Tommy would have chosen. Colonel Haley, once the image of brisk command, now sat bundled in a rug by the window, his hair thin and white as cobwebs. Yet his eyes, those sharp grey eyes, flared with intelligence the instant he saw them. "Well, if it isn't the Beresfords," he said, his voice cracked but soldierly. "Still meddling, eh? What brings you to this mausoleum?" Tuppence smiled gently. "A letter, Colonel, and an old medal." She unwrapped the handkerchief and laid the medal on his lap. For a moment he stared at it without expression. Then his fingers began to tremble. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. "It arrived yesterday by post," said Tommy. "Anonymous," along with a note suggesting an old acquaintance from Bruges might have, returned. Haley's head jerked up sharply. "Returned? You mean—" "Precisely," Tuppence said. "The man from Bruges." For a second the Colonel's expression seemed to collapse inward, as though a shadow had passed through him. "No," he said at last, almost pleading. "No, it can't be. We buried that nightmare. He never—" He broke off, clutching the armrest. His breathing had grown shallow, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting someone to enter. "Colonel," said Tuppence softly, "you know something. Tell us." He swallowed, lips working soundlessly. When the words came, they were little more than a rasp of air. He never died. The room seemed to tighten around them. Tommy leaned forward. "What do you mean, never died?" But Haley was no longer listening. His hand clutched at the medal. The next instant it slid from his fingers, clattering against the rug. His body stiffened, then went terribly still. Tuppence was already at his side, pressing 2 fingers against his neck. "He's fainted, or worse." Tommy dashed for the corridor, calling for help. The nurse hurried in with a bottle of smelling salts and a flutter of efficiency. Within minutes, a doctor was summoned, pronouncing it a mild attack brought on by excitement. The Colonel's breathing steadied, but he did not regain full consciousness. As they waited in the corridor, Tuppence's gaze was distant. "Tommy, did you see the look in his eyes when we mentioned Bruges? Sheer terror. A soldier of his sort doesn't scare easily." Tommy nodded grimly. "And that last phrase, 'he never died.' Either he meant the man himself, or the idea of him, a legend with unfinished business." "Legends don't send letters," she said, "but living men do." The nurse reappeared, smoothing her apron. "I'm afraid the Colonel will need rest now. You may visit again tomorrow, though I can't promise he'll remember much." They left quietly, stepping into the brittle afternoon sunlight. The air smelt faintly of sea salt and geraniums from the home's garden. Tuppence paused at the gate, looking back at the window where the Colonel sat motionless. "Do you suppose he'll recover enough to tell us more?" "If not," Tommy said, "we'll have to find another route to our ghost." As they walked toward the car park, Tuppence noticed a movement at the corner of her vision, a man standing by the hedge, apparently examining the view. He was tall, wearing a grey overcoat and hat, the sort of figure one could overlook in any seaside town. Yet there was something deliberate about the way he stood, hands in pockets, face turned just slightly away. "Tommy," she murmured, "don't turn your head yet. There's someone watching us." He didn't need telling twice. Years of experience had taught him the art of casual evasion. He bent to adjust his shoelace, using the motion to glance sideways. "You're right. Grey coat, bowler hat. Looks harmless enough, but he's not admiring the scenery." "Let's see how harmless." She linked her arm through his. "We'll walk past slowly. If he turns with us, we'll know." They strolled down the gravel path, their conversation light and meaningless. Tommy's golf, Tuppence's gardening, the price of petrol. The man's head followed them imperceptibly. Then, as they reached the gate, he turned away, lighting a cigarette. "Too careful," Tommy murmured. "A real watcher wouldn't stare. He'd pretend not to." "Which means he's done this before," said Tuppence. "Let's not spook him. Get in the car as though nothing's wrong." They climbed in. Tommy started the engine and drove off slowly. In the mirror, the man in grey dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his heel, and strolled toward the care home gate. "Well," Tommy said after a pause, "I suppose that answers the question of whether our letter was meant to be private." Tuppence's expression was unreadable. He was wearing gloves, Tommy, leather ones, on a warm day. They said nothing more until the town lay behind them. When they finally stopped at a cliff lay-by overlooking the sea, the horizon was fading into the pale blue haze of evening. Gulls wheeled and cried above the surf. The sound was oddly mournful. Tuppence unwrapped the medal again, turning it so that the dull surface caught the light. "Fresh fingerprints," she said softly. "Not old. Look at the sheen where someone's touched it recently. And the inscriptions faintly re-etched, as if cleaned." Meaning our mysterious correspondent wanted us to notice the detail. Or to recognize the hand that handled it. Tommy leaned against the car, arms folded. "We can't chase every ghost, Tuppence. Haley might have mixed memories. His mind's not what it was." "But fear doesn't lie," she replied. "He knew something, or someone, that terrified him enough to stop his heart." He looked out to sea, the waves catching light like shards of glass. "And now we're being followed. What do you suggest we do? Place an ad in the Times. Wanted, deceased traitor, last seen 1944. She smiled faintly. "Tomorrow we start with the bookseller who printed that Bruges novel. But tonight we lock our doors and keep that medal where it belongs, somewhere it can't be posted back again." Tommy brushed her hand. "If this ghost wants company, he's come to the wrong house. We're not easy prey, you and I." "No," she said softly, eyes on the darkening sea, "but ghosts thrive on memory, and I think he remembers us very well indeed." The last light bled out of the horizon. Somewhere far below, the tide struck the rocks with a hollow boom, like a slow drumbeat from another world. And in the distance, on the coastal road winding toward Hollowkey, a single figure in a grey overcoat paused beneath the lamplight, watching the sea until the darkness swallowed him whole. Tommy had always thought seaside towns by midweek had an air of conspiratorial leisure about them, people idling on benches who seemed to have been waiting for years, shopkeepers polishing the same glass shelves, and landladies who knew everyone's business before it became anyone's business at all. Bournemouth, seen through the lens of suspicion, felt like a stage set built for espionage. Lace curtains, polite smiles, and secrets wrapped in brown paper. The Beresfords had taken rooms in a modest guest house overlooking the pier, under the respectable cover of Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, collecting material for a local history pamphlet. It was a paper-thin alias, but one that fit neatly into middle-aged respectability, something no spy would question because it was too dull to imagine. Tuppence, however, did not do dull. By 9 o'clock that morning, she was already halfway down the main street, her hat set at a jaunty angle, pausing before an antique shop, whose window displayed a curious blend of bric-a-brac and forgotten grandeur, silver-backed brushes, war medals, and a slightly cracked porcelain figurine of Britannia. Inside, the man in the grey overcoat was speaking in low tones to the shop's proprietor. She lingered at the window, pretending to study a display of postcards. The man's reflection flickered in the glass, tall, shoulders slightly stooped, face obscured by the brim of his hat. He handed the bookseller something, a slip of paper, perhaps a receipt. The exchange was brief. Then, without so much as a glance toward her, he turned and walked briskly down the street, vanishing into the crowd of pensioners and prams. Tuppence's eyes narrowed. She pushed open the door, a little bell tinkling overhead, and stepped inside. The shop smelled of beeswax and tobacco. Behind the counter stood a lean man with a mild expression and the faintly guilty air of someone who had spent too long surrounded by other people's memories. "Good morning, madam," he said. "Looking for anything particular?" "Oh, just browsing," Tuppence replied brightly. "I adore shops like this. They smell of secrets, don't they?" The man smiled uncertainly. "We mostly deal in estate clearances these days. Old books, papers, the odd curiosity. Nothing of great value." "Really? I saw you speaking to that gentleman in the grey overcoat. He looked as though he was discussing something rather more interesting than the price of teaspoons." A flicker crossed his face, gone almost before it appeared. "A customer, regular collector, military ephemera." "How fascinating," she said, examining a silver lighter engraved with a regiment's crest. "I once knew a man who collected medals. He found the past had a nasty habit of turning up at his doorstep." He chuckled weakly. "People do like their mementos. Anything I can show you?" Her eyes roamed over the shelves, settling on a small display in the corner. A row of hardback novels, second-hand but neatly arranged, and there, between the cruel sea and a town like Alice, stood a book whose title sent a little shock through her. The Betrayal at Bruges. Tuppence picked it up, turning it over. The cover illustration showed a shadowy figure crossing a bridge under a foreign moon. No publisher's mark, only the author's initials, G.M. Her fingers tightened slightly on the spine. "I don't recall this one," she said lightly. "Is it new?" "Not new, no," the bookseller said. "Came in with a box from an estate sale last month. Rather obscure. Printed privately, I believe. Would you mind if I bought it?" He hesitated, a fraction too long. "Of course not. 2 shillings, if you please." She paid, accepted the brown paper parcel and smiled pleasantly. "I'm sure my husband will be thrilled. He adores anything about Bruges. He's quite sentimental about it, actually." When she left the shop, Tommy was waiting in the car, newspaper folded across his lap. "You were in there an eternity. Did you buy the shop?" "I bought something better." She handed him the parcel. "Our grey friend was there just before me. He and the bookseller exchanged something, and look what I found on the shelf." Tommy tore open the paper and stared. "Good Lord! The Betrayal at Bruges. You don't suppose—" "I do. It's not a coincidence. It's a message." They drove to a quiet spot near the cliff promenade and opened the book carefully. The first page was blank. The second carried a dedication to the ones who remember. The tide will return to the shore. Tuppence exhaled slowly. "That's not a literary flourish, Tommy. That's a code phrase. I've seen it before in Haley's files. It meant a safe house was compromised." Tommy rubbed his chin. "So someone's using this novel to communicate. A printed signal for old operatives, those who remember. Clever, in a morbid sort of way." She flipped through the pages. The story itself seemed ordinary enough, a wartime thriller about betrayal and lost loyalties. But scattered throughout were words underlined faintly in pencil. Not many, just a handful on each page. Together they formed no obvious pattern. "We'll copy them out tonight," she said. "There's something hidden here." Tommy frowned. "Or it's a red herring, some eccentric writer playing at spies, you know the type. Retired colonel with too much brandy and not enough excitement." "That's one possibility," she conceded. But the man in grey didn't look like he came for pleasure reading. They returned to the guest house, where Tuppence spread the book open on the dressing table, examining it under the soft glow of the lamp. The underlined words began to form phrases when read diagonally down each page, a habit used in wartime to conceal short messages within harmless text. Tommy leaned over her shoulder. "Listen to this. Return, file, to, Tide's house." The Tide's house again. It must refer to a location. "Where the tide forgets the shore," she murmured, remembering the cipher from the letter. "That phrase has followed us from the beginning." Tommy straightened. "Tomorrow we'll ask the bookseller where the estate came from. If he's hiding something, we'll flush it out." Before they could discuss further, there came a light knock at the door. Tuppence slipped the book under the tablecloth. "Come in," she called. The landlady entered, rosy and cheerful. "Just checking you've got enough towels, dears. Lovely weather tomorrow. They're having the summer fair down by the pier." "Splendid," Tommy said heartily. "We'll be there. Nothing like a fair to cheer the soul." When the door closed, Tuppence muttered, "She's too friendly. I'll wager she reports every new guest to someone." Tommy grinned. "You're seeing spies in every teapot again, old girl." "And I've yet to be wrong," she said. The next morning they returned to the shop. The little bell chimed as they entered. The bookseller looked up from polishing a magnifying glass, startled but polite. "Back again so soon?" he said. "Yes," Tommy replied easily. "My wife adores the book she bought yesterday. She'd like to know if you have others by the same author." The man blinked. "I'm afraid not. It was the only one." "Pity. Who was the estate, if I may ask?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "An old sea captain, retired in Swanage, name of Martin, died in June. His things came through an auctioneer in Poole." Tuppence's eyes met Tommy's. Martin, the same name etched into one of Haley's old case files. A shipping magnate turned war liaison. "Fascinating coincidence," she said softly. "I wonder what became of his papers." "No idea," said the bookseller too quickly. "I just handle what I'm given. If you'll excuse me, I have deliveries." They stepped back into the street, the morning bright and brittle. "He's lying," Tuppence said. "And badly." "Agreed," Tommy murmured. "But to what end? If he's part of this, he's small fry, an errand boy, not the brains." They turned to walk away, but Tuppence's sharp eye caught something in the window. The book she had bought yesterday was gone, replaced by another copy, identical in every detail, the same title, the same initials. Yet when she looked closely, the cover illustration was slightly different. The bridge shadow was reversed. "Tommy," she whispered, "that wasn't there before." He glanced at it and gave a low whistle. "Two editions of a book that supposedly doesn't exist. Someone's playing a clever game." As they stood there, the reflection of a grey overcoat passed behind them in the glass. There for a heartbeat, gone the next. Tuppence turned sharply, but the pavement was empty. Only a paper scrap fluttered near the curb. She stooped and picked it up. A torn page corner bearing a single penciled word, "Tomorrow." She met Tommy's eyes. He's not just following us, he's setting the stage. Tommy pocketed the scrap, his jaw tightening. "Then tomorrow, my dear, we'll make sure he has an audience." "Where the tide forgets the shore," Tommy read aloud, his finger tracing the penciled words in the margin of The Betrayal at Bruges. "I'll say this for our ghostly friend. He had a poetic streak. Pity about his taste in stationery." Tuppence leaned over his shoulder, her chin resting lightly on her hand. "That phrase isn't poetic, Tommy. It's a code, a wartime one. It was used for a compromised meeting point, a safe house burned or a contact exposed. It means danger, and whoever left it wanted us to know something went wrong." Tommy dropped the book onto the table with a soft thud. "Darling, if I'd wanted danger, I'd have gone into politics." "Too late. You're already married to it," she said crisply. She stood and moved to the window of their Hollow-key cottage, watching the sea glint faintly between the roofs. A tide that forgets the shore, that would be the stretch east of St. Aldhelm's Head. The locals call it Tide's End. There's a derelict coastguard's cottage there. No one's lived in it since the 50s. Tommy sighed, the sound halfway between affection and resignation. "I knew the morning would come when you'd propose a scenic drive to a ruin with criminal associations. You always were a romantic." She smiled faintly. "It's where the clue points, and you adore my scenic drives. Bring a torch." The road to Tide's End wound between chalk cliffs and scrub, the sea flashing intermittently like a blade through the gorse. By the time they reached the headland, the afternoon had turned brittle and pale, the kind of English day that feels indecisive about its own weather. A gull shrieked overhead, distant and solitary. "There," Tuppence said, pointing. The cottage crouched at the edge of the cliffs, half swallowed by ivy, its windows blind and salt-scoured. The front gate sagged inward, creaking softly as Tommy pushed it open. The air smelled of seaweed and cold stone. "Well," he murmured, "picturesque, if one has a morbid streak. You're sure this is the place?" "Quite sure." She was already walking toward the door, her footsteps muffled by the wild grass. "Haley mentioned it once. A listening post during the war. We used it ourselves for a short time." Tommy tried the door. It resisted, then gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but not untouched. The first thing he noticed was the faint trace of warmth, as if someone had recently been there. The second was the smell of tea. On the rough wooden table stood a chipped mug, the bottom still stained damp. Beside it lay a small pile of tea leaves and a candle stub, melted into a puddle of wax. Tuppence bent to examine the table. "Look, crumbs. Someone's eaten here, and not long ago. The candle's fresh and the wax is soft." Tommy moved to the fireplace. The ashes were cold, but the soot clung loosely, as though stirred within the last day. "Our host doesn't clean up after himself. A man after my own heart." "Not your handwriting on the wall, I hope," she said, nodding toward a scrawl faintly visible above the mantel. The single word, "Return," written in chalk. He frowned. "Return what? Or to where?" "Perhaps to Bruges," she murmured. "Or to the past. This cottage was a meeting point once. Whoever came here knew it, and expected someone else to come too." Tommy looked around. The cottage consisted of 2 rooms, a kitchen living area and a smaller back room whose door hung crookedly on its hinges. He stepped through, ducking his head. The back room was bare except for a rickety chair and a heap of old newspapers. One page had been torn and pinned to the wall with a nail. It was dated 2 days ago. "Here's your proof of recent tenants," he called. "Someone's a loyal reader of the Dorset Chronicle." Tuppence joined him, peering at the page. An article about the reopening of the local library occupied most of it, but a short column near the bottom had been underlined in pencil. Obituary: Sir Gerald Martin, shipping magnate and philanthropist, died peacefully at his London residence. He is survived by his widow, Lydia Martin. Tuppence drew a breath. Martin again. The same name from the bookseller's estate sale. Tommy's eyebrows rose. "The plot thickens and the deceased multiply. Do you suppose our friend in grey killed him or simply borrowed his obituary for dramatic flair?" "I don't know," she said slowly, "but it ties the threads together. Bruges, Martin the Code, and now this place. Everything's pointing toward the same name." She turned, scanning the room again, her instincts humming. There was something oppressive about the silence, the kind that listens back. A faint sound, almost a shift of gravel, came from outside. "Tommy," she said quietly, "don't move too suddenly, but I think we're being watched." He didn't answer, only reached up and brushed the curtain aside a fraction of an inch. Through the sliver of light, he saw a figure at the far edge of the field, motionless against the skyline, tall, in a grey overcoat. The wind tugged at the fabric, but the man didn't stir. "Well," Tommy said under his breath, "our fan club's growing persistent." "Do we leave?" "Not before we know what he's guarding." They waited a moment longer, then slipped quietly toward the back door, exiting into a narrow path that curved behind the cottage and down toward the rocks. From there they circled round, crouching low among the scrub until they had a clear view of the cliff edge. The man in grey was standing quite still, staring toward the sea. Then, as though sensing their eyes, he turned sharply and was gone, swallowed by the dip of the path. Tommy exhaled. Either he's a magician or he's been practicing his disappearing act. Tuppence touched his arm. "Let's go back inside. There's something we missed." They returned cautiously. The air in the cottage felt heavier now, as though the walls had absorbed their unease. Tuppence knelt by the hearth, brushing aside ashes until something metallic glinted beneath the debris, a corner of a photograph. She freed it carefully, the paper brittle with age. It showed the 2 of them, younger, smiling in wartime uniform, standing before a row of stone houses in Bruges. Between them, partly obscured, loomed a man in civilian clothes, his face turned slightly away. A shadow stretched from him, long and distorted, across the cobblestones. Tommy's voice was low. "That was taken the week before the operation. I don't remember anyone else being there." "Neither do I," Tuppence said. "But someone did, and whoever he was, he's followed us back." They stared at the photograph in silence. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, making the door rattle faintly in its frame. Tommy slipped the picture into his pocket. "We'll have it developed again, see if we can bring out the face, but for now, I think our welcome's worn out." Tuppence nodded. They stepped outside just as the first drops of drizzle began to fall. The horizon had vanished behind a sheet of grey, the sea merging with the sky in a colourless blur. Somewhere below, waves crashed against the rocks with slow persistence. "Tommy," she said softly, "do you think he's dead? Sir Gerald, I mean." He hesitated. If he is, someone's still carrying his torch. And if he isn't, he's carrying a grudge. They climbed into the car, headlights slicing through the dimness. As they turned back toward the main road, Tuppence glanced in the mirror. The cottage had already disappeared behind the curve of the cliffs, but for a fleeting moment she thought she saw movement, a faint gleam, as if someone had struck a match in the window. Then darkness again. Back at Hollow Key, they set the photograph and the book side by side on the dining table. The candlelight flickered over their faces. "You realize," Tommy said, "we're chasing ghosts with a flair for drama. Anonymous letters, mysterious watchers, symbolic dedications. It's almost flattering." "Flattering," she echoed. "It's fatalism in fancy dress. Someone's playing with us." He poured them each a small measure of brandy. "Then let's drink to the player. May he slip on his own chessboard." She clinked her glass against his, but her expression remained thoughtful. "The cipher was a warning, Tommy. A safe house compromised. And now we've walked straight into it." He smiled faintly. "Yes, but with panache." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 8. The sound rolled through the cottage, steady and reassuring, yet when it faded, the silence it left behind was sharper than before. Outside, the sea continued its endless conversation with the shore, coming close, retreating, forgetting. Tuppence gathered the book, the medal, and the photograph, arranging them neatly in a row. "3 pieces of a puzzle," she murmured. "And somewhere out there, the man in grey knows what the picture looks like when it's finished." Tommy set down his glass. "Then tomorrow, my dear, we start assembling it properly." He reached to turn off the lamp, but just as the room slipped into darkness, Tuppence's eyes caught a flicker of movement beyond the curtain, a passing shadow, or perhaps only imagination. The kettle clicked suddenly in the kitchen, startling them both. Tommy laughed softly. "You see, even the appliances are conspiring against us." But when Tuppence went to check, the kettle was cold, its plug untouched. Only the faint smell of burnt wax lingered in the air, the scent of a candle recently extinguished. She looked back at Tommy. "Someone's been here." He frowned. "Impossible. We locked up before leaving." "Not impossible," she said, "merely practiced." The clock struck again, though it wasn't time for it to do so. The second chime echoed through the quiet cottage, hollow and insistent, like an echo from years long past. Tuppence met Tommy's eyes. "He's not finished with us yet." The next morning, the sea was doing its best impression of innocence. Gulls wheeled lazily above the rooftops, and the village of Hollow Key shimmered with that deceptive calm which always made Tuppence suspicious. She was spooning marmalade onto her toast when Tommy said, with studied casualness, "You know, darling, it's extraordinary how often a photograph turns up just before the trouble begins." She didn't look up. "It's equally extraordinary how often you pretend not to enjoy it." "Enjoy it." My nerves are beginning to sound like a typewriter in a thunderstorm. But he smiled and she smiled back, the familiar exchange that always preceded the next plunge into danger. The photograph lay between them on the breakfast table, the stranger's shadow slanting across their younger faces. Tuppence had pinned it beneath a magnifying glass, studying it for the 100th time. "You see this shape," she said, tapping the blurred shoulder beside Tommy's younger self. "It's too broad for Gorman. And look, the cuff, military cut but not regulation. That's civilian tailoring with money behind it." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "So, we're hunting a well-dressed ghost now?" "We're hunting someone who's been rich for a very long time," she replied, "and who can afford to play games with the past." Their first stop was Bournemouth, not the genteel promenade of postcards, but the quieter lanes behind it, where the houses had peeling paint and excellent gossip. The King's Head stood on a corner by the tram terminus, its sign creaking faintly in the breeze. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and pipe tobacco, and behind the bar, polishing a glass with studied indifference, stood Albert. Tuppence's face lit with recognition. "Albert, as I live and breathe!" He blinked once, then grinned broadly, dropping the glass into the sink. "Well, strike me pink. Mr. and Mrs. B in the flesh. You've not changed a bit, just gone posh around the edges." Tommy laughed. "Flattery from you, Albert, is as rare as an honest politician." Albert leaned over the counter, lowering his voice. "I heard you'd retired. Couldn't quite believe it. What brings you to my humble gin palace?" Tuppence slid the photograph across the bar. "Recognition, mostly. Do you remember this?" Albert squinted, then gave a low whistle. "That's Bruges, all right, and that fellow in the middle, can't place him, but I'd swear I've seen him somewhere since." Tuppence leaned in. "Since when?" "Couple of years back. Came in here, funny enough. Ordered whiskey like he owned the distillery. Smart talker. Called himself Martin, Sir Gerald Martin." Tommy exchanged a glance with his wife. "That name keeps returning like a bad penny." Albert nodded sagely. "He's a local celebrity now. Runs some shipping charity, funds libraries, that sort of thing. Rich as sin and twice as smooth. There's talk he was mixed up with the government once. Something hush-hush." "Any talk about Bruges?" Tuppence asked. Albert hesitated. "Not from him, but I've heard whispers that the old traitor never died, just changed his skin. They say he came back from the war with a new name and a clean passport. If you ask me, money's the best disguise there is." Tommy tapped the bar thoughtfully. "And Martin fits that bill neatly. If he financed the betrayal at Bruges, he's sending signals to the old network. A resurrection by print." Albert poured them both a whiskey. "You two always did have a taste for the impossible. But if you're going up against a man like that, mind you don't end up on the obituary page yourselves." Tuppence smiled faintly. "We've survived worse editors." They left the pub just before noon. The promenade gleamed with that antiseptic brightness peculiar to English seaside towns. Sunlight, salt, and the faint smell of disinfectant. A brass band played "The Blue Danube" with misplaced optimism. Tommy shaded his eyes. "Well, my dear, we've learned that ghosts can afford yachts and charitable foundations. What next?" "We find out why he's chosen now to haunt us." By mid-afternoon, they were back at the cottage, Tuppence telephoning old contacts in London while Tommy went through the ciphered pages again. The name Martin cropped up twice in the underlined words from the novel, once alongside return and again with file. He was bent over his notes when the telephone rang. "Tommy Beresford speaking," he said. There was a pause, long enough for the line's hum to deepen. Then a voice, low and precise, spoke. "If you value her life, stop digging." He froze. "Who is this?" But the line had already gone dead. For a moment he simply stared at the receiver. Then he turned sharply. "Tuppence?" No answer. The sitting room was empty. Her handbag still lay on the armchair, open, gloves folded neatly beside it. But the front door, the one he was certain he'd locked, stood ajar. The afternoon light poured in like a trespasser. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stepped outside. The lane was deserted. Only the cat blinked up at him from the garden wall, tail flicking lazily as if to say, "You're too late." Tommy's voice was tight when he spoke aloud. "All right, old man. Think." He went back inside, scanning every detail with trained precision. No sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no footprints on the rug. On the table, however, something had been moved. The book, The Betrayal at Bruges, lay open to a page he didn't remember leaving marked. A pencil line ran beneath a single sentence. "Those who forget must follow the tide." He read it twice, then snapped the book shut. "You won't get away with this," he muttered. "Not with her." He grabbed his coat and headed for the car. The coastal road shimmered in the late afternoon haze. Every bend looked the same. Every signpost seemed a repetition, until he reached the cliff path where they'd found the derelict cottage. The gate hung open again. He stopped the car and got out, the air humming faintly with the sound of insects and distant surf. "Tuppence," he called. Only the gulls answered. He stepped inside the cottage. The air was cold now, stripped of any trace of human warmth. But on the table, beside the candle stub, lay something new, a single sheet torn from a notebook. Her handwriting leapt out at him, quick and decisive. "Don't follow me. I'm safe. Trust no one named Martin." Tommy's heart slammed once hard. "Oh no, you don't," he muttered. You've pulled that trick before and it never ends well." A movement outside made him spin round. Through the cracked window he saw a car parked farther down the track. Black, polished, unmistakably expensive. A man leaned against it, lighting a cigarette. Grey overcoat. The watcher again. Tommy stepped to the doorway, voice steady. "All right, my friend. If we're to keep bumping into each other, let's at least be introduced." But the man didn't move. He flicked the cigarette into the grass, got into the car, and drove away, tires crunching on gravel. The sound faded into the sea's slow roar. Tommy swore softly. Then his eyes caught a glint near the ground, a matchbook fallen where the man had stood. He stooped to pick it up. Embossed in gold letters were the words, "The Neptune Club, Bournemouth Pier." He pocketed it. All roads lead to the sea, apparently. It was after dusk when he returned to the village. The cottage lights glowed faintly, but the lane outside was deserted. He entered quietly, half expecting another note, another shadow. The clock ticked calmly, absurdly innocent. Then he noticed the faintest outline of footprints on the carpet, small, familiar. "Tuppence," he said softly. She appeared from the kitchen, cheeks pale, hair slightly dishevelled. "Good heavens, Tommy, where have you been?" He stared. "Where have I been? I found your note at the Cliff House. I've been halfway to a breakdown." Her eyes widened. "My note? I haven't been near that place today. I went to the post office, that's all, and when I came back, the door was open." They looked at each other, understanding dawning between them like a sudden storm. "Someone wanted me to find that message," Tommy said grimly. "Wanted to lure me out." "And to separate us," Tuppence added. Classic misdirection. "Oh, Tommy, we've let them take the lead." She sat down, exhaustion and fury mingling in her expression. "While you were playing hide-and-seek on the cliffs, I made a call to London. Sir Gerald Martin is very much alive. In fact, he's giving a charity lecture tomorrow evening at his estate outside Evesham." Tommy exhaled slowly. "Then that's our next destination." "Yes, but with care," she warned. "He financed the betrayal at Bruges. If he's our ghost, he knows every move we'll make." He looked toward the window where the curtains stirred faintly, as if someone had just moved past outside. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time we surprised him for once." Tuppence smiled thinly. "Let's pay a social call on a ghost." Later, when the house was silent, Tommy sat alone at the table, the telephone receiver resting beside him. The words from that anonymous voice still rang in his ears. "If you value her life, stop digging." He reached for the photograph again, turning it over. On the back, faint pencil marks traced a pattern, almost erased. He shaded it lightly with his pencil until the words emerged. "Neptune, Wednesday at 9. He stared at it, pulse quickening. "Neptune Club," he murmured. "Tomorrow night." He rose quietly, careful not to wake Tuppence, and slipped the photograph into his pocket. The wind outside rattled the window pane. Somewhere in the darkness, unseen eyes might have been watching. But Tommy Beresford had the look of a man who'd decided that ghosts, however dangerous, were still mortal after all. Dawn crept into Hollow Key on a silence that felt wrong. Tommy had barely slept. The second cup on the table was cold where Tuppence had left it hours before. The breakfast table still held 2 cups, one half drunk, the other cooling untouched. Tuppence's chair was pushed back at a curious angle, as though she'd risen suddenly. A faint breeze stirred the curtains. Her handbag was gone. So was she. Tommy stood in the middle of the sitting room, coat half on, heart thudding in the quiet. "Right," he said aloud, trying to sound businesslike. "She's probably gone to the post office, or the grocer's, or—" He broke off. Tuppence never left without a word, not even to chase a clue. He looked again. The front door had been left on the latch, and near the threshold, faint marks scored the tile. The scrape of a heel dragged, then lifted. "Not good," he muttered, and was out of the house before the clock finished striking 9. He began with the obvious: the post office, the King's Head, the antique shop. Each errand ended the same way: friendly incomprehension, sympathetic shakes of the head. By noon he was pacing the high street like a man rehearsing panic. It was the bookseller who cracked first. Tommy found him behind the counter, pale and twitching, pretending to dust a row of detective novels. When he saw Tommy, the duster froze mid-air. I've told the police all I know, he stammered. The police haven't been told anything, Tommy said pleasantly, which makes that a most interesting lie. Where is my wife? The man's throat bobbed. She came in about an hour ago, said she wanted to look at another copy of that Bruges book. While she was inside, a car pulled up. Black Bentley, London plates. The driver got out and asked for her by name. She looked surprised. They spoke for a minute, then she went with him. Voluntarily, I think, but what? She left this behind. He opened a drawer and produced a small leather glove, Tuppence's, creased at the fingers, the pearl button torn loose. Tommy's jaw tightened. What direction? Toward the cliffs, sir, near the old signal tower. Tommy turned for the door. The bookseller caught his sleeve. Sir, there was a man watching from across the street. Grey coat, hat. He smiled when the car left. Tommy's voice was level. Then I suggest you forget you saw him. The road to the cliffs wound like a scar through the heath. He drove fast, the wind battering the open window, his mind running through possibilities. Ransom, trap, or Tuppence's own infernal initiative. He found the signal tower half a mile beyond the last milestone. It stood alone against the sky, rusted and skeletal, a relic of the war. The sea crashed below, indifferent as eternity. Near the base of the tower lay her handbag. He crouched, opening it with shaking hands. Inside, her compact, her notebook, a lipstick snapped in half and nothing else. No struggle marks, no blood. Only a red silk scarf tangled round the iron railing above, fluttering like a distress flag. For a moment the world narrowed to the sound of the wind and the metallic snapping of fabric. Then Tommy saw it, in the dust beside the steps, half buried, a scrap of paper. He eased it out with care. The writing was unmistakably hers, quick, firm, confident even now. He's alive, working from within. Trust no one until you see the lilies. He exhaled sharply. Good girl. He turned toward the cliffs, scanning for any trace of the car she'd mentioned, mind already assembling his next move. That note meant two things. She wasn't dead, and she was up to her neck in something dangerous, as usual. He slipped the paper into his wallet, straightened his shoulders, and turned back toward the car. The plan was simple. Contact Albert, call in a few favours, and start digging into Sir Gerald Martin's household. Wherever Tuppence had gone, Martin wasn't far behind. But before Tommy could leave, a sound stopped him, the faint hum of an approaching engine. He ducked behind the tower. A sleek black Bentley rolled into view, sunlight glinting on its chrome. The driver stepped out, tall, gloved, anonymous. He walked to the railing, glanced down at the scarf, and smiled faintly before lighting a cigarette. Tommy caught the glint of something in his other hand, a signet ring carved with a crest, a lily. So that was the mark, the lilies. When the man turned back to the car, Tommy moved quietly, following the line of the cliff path until he could see the license plate clearly. He noted the number, then melted into the heather as the Bentley pulled away. By the time dusk fell, Tommy's trail had led him 30 miles inland to a gated drive flanked by yews. A discreet brass plaque read, Martin Hall. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, gazing at the lights in the distance. The house rose from the trees like a theatrical backdrop. Tall windows, golden glow, servants' shadows crossing the blinds. The sound of distant laughter drifted on the air. Operation Resurrection, he murmured. Let's see who's rising from what. He would have gone charging up the drive had not caution, acquired through long experience, intervened. Better to observe first, and if Tuppence was anywhere near that house, she would have already thought the same. He eased the car into a copse of trees and settled in to watch. The narrative shifts, a quiet dissolve, the voice softening as though the light changes. Tuppence Beresford stood in a narrow servants' corridor, hands raw from polishing silver, the starch of a borrowed apron scratching her neck. The smell of furniture polish and roast pheasant filled the air. From the dining room beyond came the muffled clink of glasses and the measured tones of cultivated conversation. She adjusted the maid's cap and smiled faintly to herself. She'd always believed in the value of improvisation. This particular improvisation had begun 3 hours earlier when she'd stepped out of the Bentley with her most innocent expression and declared, "Lady Martin engaged me through the registry, ma'am. Temporary assistance for the evening." The housekeeper, harried and unsuspecting, had nodded and waved her in. Now she moved silently between pantry and hall, eyes sharp for anything useful. She'd glimpsed Sir Gerald earlier, tall, silver-haired, with that particular brand of effortless charm that made philanthropy look like temptation. He'd spoken warmly to his guests, but his eyes, those eyes had the cold gleam of someone who counted loyalty like currency. Through the crack of the door she saw them seated round the table, 4 men and Sir Gerald at the head. On the polished wood beside him lay a folder stamped in red, Operation Resurrection. Her pulse quickened. "Gentlemen," Sir Gerald was saying, his voice calm and assured, "the network must reactivate quietly. The archives from Bruges, what's left of them, are already being copied. Within a week we'll have leverage enough to keep certain ministers in our debt for another decade." One of the guests, a thin man with an academic stoop, shifted uneasily. "I was under the impression this was a charitable initiative." Sir Gerald's smile was thin. "Charity begins where the government ends. We all serve our causes, Professor. Mine simply pays better." There was soft laughter. Tuppence's fingers tightened on the tray she carried. She felt a thrill of both fear and triumph. She was inside the very heart of it. Then the butler entered, murmuring something in Sir Gerald's ear. The magnate's expression flickered. "Ah," he said lightly, "our uninvited guest, it seems, has arrived." Tuppence froze. "Who? Tommy? Or—" "Show him to the study," Sir Gerald continued. "I never refuse a man who comes to bargain." As the guests rose, Tuppence slipped backward into the corridor, heart racing. If Tommy had followed the trail here— But no, she thought quickly, he wouldn't be so foolish. Would he? She darted into the servants' pantry, shutting the door softly behind her. A single gas lamp cast a wavering glow over rows of silver trays. On the wall hung a framed list of household staff, 3 names crossed through in red pencil. Below them, newly added, M. Turner, temporary, her alias. So they knew. The sound of footsteps approached. She crouched behind the sideboard as 2 men entered, the butler and another servant. "Sir Gerald says to keep an eye on the new girl," the butler murmured. "She's not registry stock, not really. Something off about her." "Shall I search her room?" "Do it after dinner, and if she bolts—" They didn't finish. The words dissolved into the steady rhythm of footsteps fading down the corridor. Tuppence rose, shaking slightly. Time to act. She slipped out through a side door into the night air. The gardens stretched ahead, immaculate under the moon, and beyond them, the cliff edge. Lights from a distant lane glimmered faintly. If she could reach the gatehouse, she might find a telephone. But before she could take 2 steps, a voice spoke behind her. "Going somewhere, Mrs. Beresford?" She turned slowly. Sir Gerald Martin stood by the terrace doors, hands clasped behind his back, expression almost courteous. "How very like your husband," he went on. "Curious, persistent, and quite incapable of minding his own business." Tuppence met his gaze evenly. "Curiosity keeps one young," he smiled. "Then I must thank you both for rejuvenating me. However, games are for amateurs. You've stumbled into something far older than either of you imagine." He gestured toward the house. "Come, let's discuss history." Her mind raced. If she resisted, she'd be overpowered. If she complied, she might learn more, and buy time for Tommy, wherever he was. She lifted her chin. "After you, Sir Gerald." He inclined his head, amused, and led her back inside. The scene widens, back to the road beyond the estate, where Tommy watches from the trees, unaware that the silhouette crossing the lit windows is hers. He sees Sir Gerald's figure beside her, and feels the first edge of dread cut through resolve. "She's alive," he whispers, "and right in the lion's den." He starts the engine softly, the headlamps off, and rolls the car farther into shadow. "Hold on, old girl," he murmurs. "Let's see what resurrection really looks like." The drawing room at Martin Hall was designed for confidence. Everything in it gleamed, mahogany polished to a sheen, brass fittings catching candlelight, curtains so heavy they seemed to hush the air. A fire burned discreetly, more for atmosphere than warmth. The kind of room, Tuppence thought, where secrets were meant to sound respectable. She stood a few paces behind Sir Gerald's chair, silver tray in hand, the borrowed maid's cap tilting precariously on her curls. If she tilted her head just so, she could see the red-stamped folder on the table. Operation Resurrection. She'd heard the phrase whispered all evening, always with a little thrill of importance. But what she saw now chilled her far more than she'd expected. The men gathered round the fire were not petty smugglers or wartime hangovers. They were men with clean fingernails and polished vowels, civil servants, advisors, businessmen who had exchanged camouflage for club ties. A few faces she almost recognized from old photographs in the Times, the sort of men who signed documents that changed other people's lives. Sir Gerald himself lounged in the centre, a brandy glass resting elegantly on one knee. "Gentlemen," he said, "the past, like any asset, must occasionally be re-evaluated. We invested in certain individuals during the war. Some were useful, some were loyal, and a few were inconveniently both. Now those same individuals occupy positions where loyalty can be, shall we say, monetized." The man nearest the fire coughed uneasily. "Blackmail, you mean?" "Influence," Sir Gerald corrected, with a smile that would have looked handsome on a statue. "A few of our sleeping friends need only be reminded that the records from Bruges still exist. Once resurrected, they'll perform admirably." Tuppence's fingers tightened on the tray. Files from Bruges, those were supposed to have been destroyed with the safe house. So that was Operation Resurrection, not salvation, but extortion reborn. A second man, thin and anxious, said quietly, "And if the records were lost?" "They were never lost," Sir Gerald replied, "merely misplaced. I kept copies. The ministry never knew. There's profit in memory, gentlemen, when everyone else prefers to forget." He raised his glass. "To the resurrection." They drank. Tuppence could smell the brandy, sharp and sweet, mingling with the faint scent of wax polish. She lowered her eyes, heart hammering. A part of her admired the audacity, another part wanted to throw the drink in his face. Then, from the corridor beyond, the sound of laughter floated nearer, high, feminine, familiar in an unpleasant way. Sir Gerald's eyes flicked toward the door. "Ah," he murmured, "Lydia Montrose." Tuppence went rigid. Lydia Montrose, the woman who'd once betrayed an entire network in Cairo, and nearly them along with it. A double agent of the old school, beautiful, poisonous, and difficult to kill even metaphorically. The door opened and she swept in, still elegant, though time had polished rather than faded her. Silver fox stole, diamonds discreet, smile sharper than either. "Darling Gerald," she purred, "you do throw the most incriminating parties." He kissed her hand. "Lydia, my dear, you're late." "Fashionably," she said, and her eyes drifted lazily round the room, until they reached Tuppence. For a heartbeat the world seemed to stop. Recognition sparked like a struck match. Lydia's smile faltered, then returned, brighter and colder. "My word," she said lightly, "you do employ efficient staff. That face, it's almost nostalgic." Tuppence dropped her gaze, murmuring, "Another drink." "Madam." Her voice was lower, steadier than she felt. Lydia tilted her head, considering. "No, thank you. I never drink when I'm remembering." Sir Gerald chuckled. "She's new from the registry. Don't tease her." "Oh, but teasing is how I confirm a memory." Lydia took a step closer, her perfume, a dark, expensive scent, filling the air between them. "Haven't we met before, my dear? Somewhere terribly unfortunate, perhaps?" Tuppence met her gaze, the faintest smile playing at her lips. "I can't imagine, madam. I've been respectable all my life." A small ripple of laughter went round the room. Sir Gerald gestured toward the hall. "That will be all for now, Miss Turner." Tuppence curtsied, retreating. Lydia's eyes followed her until the door closed. In the servants' corridor, Tuppence leaned against the wall, forcing herself to breathe. One slip, one tremor, and Lydia would have her exposed before the next course. She needed to warn Tommy, now. She hurried to the telephone alcove at the end of the passage. The house exchange board gleamed with brass plugs and cords. The night operator, a young footman, was idly sketching in a notebook. "His lordship said no outgoing calls tonight," he said automatically. Tuppence smiled sweetly. "And when his lordship changes his mind, he'll be furious you didn't help him sooner." That startled him enough to hesitate. She leaned in, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just connect me to the gatehouse. A delivery's expected. If it fails, I'll be blamed, and you'll be the one he blames next." He blinked, then obeyed. She waited until the cord clicked home, then lowered her voice. Gatehouse, this is Turner. There's a parcel for collection, Neptune, 9 o'clock. Tell the man it's urgent. It wasn't much of a code, but Tommy would recognize it. Neptune 9. I'm in the lion's den. She replaced the receiver just as footsteps approached. Lydia's. The older woman appeared in the archway, smiling faintly. I do hate eavesdroppers who think they're invisible. Tuppence's mind spun. Just relaying a message, madam. Kitchen business. Lydia studied her a moment longer, then said almost softly, I know that voice. You used it once in Alexandria, when you pretended to be a nurse. You were younger then. Tuppence's pulse thudded, but she kept her tone bright. You must mistake me for someone more glamorous. Don't insult me with denial, Lydia said. I've survived too many betrayals to miss the smell of one. For a moment neither moved. The faint ticking of the hall clock filled the space between them. Then Lydia smiled again, cat-like, amused. Still, I suppose I owe you a debt. You and your husband saved my life once. I've always wondered why. Professional courtesy, Tuppence said. Or vanity, Lydia murmured. You always wanted the last word. But tonight, my dear, you won't get it. She turned gracefully and disappeared back toward the drawing room. Tuppence exhaled, her knees threatening to give way. There was no time to think. She slipped down the back stair toward the servants' entrance, heart hammering. Outside, the gardens lay drenched in moonlight. She had almost reached the hedge when a shadow detached itself from the darkness. Going somewhere, Miss Turner? The butler's voice was soft, almost pitying. She straightened. Air, that's all. It's stifling inside. He shook his head. Sir Gerald's orders are strict. No one leaves until dawn. I see. Her eyes darted to the gatehouse light far beyond the lawn. Then perhaps you'll escort me back in. Gladly. They returned through the hall where Lydia stood by the staircase, waiting. Her expression was radiant, triumphant. Our little masquerade is over, I think. Sir Gerald emerged from the study, voice cool. Really, Lydia, I thought you'd quit melodrama. She's not a servant, Lydia said. She's Tuppence Beresford. For an instant the silence seemed to hum. Then Sir Gerald smiled, slow and appreciative. Well, he said, that explains much. I wondered how long it would take you to come sniffing. The husband must be nearby, yes? Tuppence lifted her chin. Closer than you think. Splendid. I do like reunions. But for the moment, he nodded to the butler, kindly show Mrs. Beresford to the green room. Lock it. The butler stepped forward, but Tuppence raised a hand. If you imagine that's how this evening ends, you're badly out of practice, Sir Gerald. Spies don't go quietly anymore. He laughed. Neither do ghosts. She acted before thought could intervene. The tray in her hands became a weapon. She swung it hard, catching the lamp at the edge of the mantel. It crashed to the floor, shattering, sparks flaring as oil splattered across the carpet. In the confusion, she darted sideways, through the side door and into the servants' corridor once more. The house erupted in shouts. She ran, skirts gathered, through the warren of passageways toward the kitchens. Smoke began to curl upward where the lamp had fallen. She yanked open a back door and slipped into the night. In the distance, the faint blare of a motor horn cut through the commotion. 3 short blasts, then 2. Their old signal. Relief flooded her. Tommy! She tore across the lawn, the gravel biting through her thin shoes. Behind her, figures spilled from the terrace, calling orders. A spotlight beam swept across the grounds, dazzling white. She threw herself behind a hedge, crawling until she reached the drive. The car waited there, engine idling, half hidden under the trees. Tommy leaned out, whispering fiercely, "Quickly!" She tumbled in, breathless, hair escaping the maid's cap. He slammed the door, reversed down the track, and they sped into darkness. For a few minutes neither spoke. Only the rush of air and the steady thrum of the engine filled the silence. Then Tommy said, almost conversationally, "You picked a fine evening for a new job. How's the catering business?" Tuppence laughed shakily. "Profitable in information at least. He's running a resurrection all right, reviving the old spy network to blackmail the powerful. And he's got proof from Bruges to do it." "Where?" "In his study. Files labelled under the old operation numbers. And Gerald's not alone. Lydia Montrose is here, working both sides again." Tommy whistled low. "I thought she'd retired to Monte Carlo to ruin millionaires at baccarat." "She's back to ruining nations instead." He shot her a sideways glance. "Did they suspect you?" "Lydia did. She recognized me. but I managed a small diversion with a tray and a lamp." He grinned despite himself. "One day, Tuppence, you'll set the whole of England on fire just to prove a point." "Only if it's necessary." They turned onto the coastal road, the sea gleaming faintly below. Far behind them, a glow was beginning to rise over the trees. Smoke, or perhaps only reflected light from the house. "What now?" he asked. "We find those files before Martin moves them. He'll expect us to run, so instead, we go back?" She nodded. Before the first stars vanished, they'd be back on that estate, hunters in reverse. "Tomorrow night, through the servant's wing again, Operation Resurrection is about to face a proper burial." Tommy chuckled. "You realize, of course, that we're probably driving straight into a trap." "Of course," she said, settling back in the seat, eyes glittering. "But at least we'll arrive fashionably late." The evening had all the makings of a success. The driveway to Martin Hall gleamed with motorcars and jewels, laughter drifted like perfume from the portico, and the great house pulsed with polite admiration for itself. It was a night for champagne, not conspiracy, which, as Tommy Beresford observed grimly from the hedgerow, made it the perfect night for mischief. "Charity," he murmured, watching the glitter of pearls and tuxedos through the trees, "is the best camouflage of all." Beside him, Tuppence adjusted her borrowed cloak, the faint scent of starch clinging to the fabric. "And betrayal," she replied, "is the best entertainment." She smiled tightly. "Shall we?" They approached in separate intervals, she through the main entrance with an air of practised entitlement, he through the side gardens, moving among the catering vans. Their plan was simple in outline and terrifying in execution. While the guests fluttered over auctions and canapes, Tommy would find his way into Sir Gerald Martin's private study, the sanctum that hid the Bruges files. Inside, Martin Hall shimmered like a dream of aristocracy. Chandeliers threw gold over marble. Footmen glided in synchronized silence. The auction was in full swing. A painting, a string quartet, a hum of discreet greed. From the grand staircase, Sir Gerald watched his guests with the serenity of a man who owned not only the house, but everyone inside it. Tuppence, a vision in borrowed silk, slipped through the crowd like an afterthought. She had chosen the kind of gown that demanded invisibility, elegant but forgettable. Near the buffet, she caught sight of Lydia Montrose, laughing too brightly beside a colonel's wife, her eyes flicking towards Sir Gerald with feline affection. "She never tires of playing both sides," Tuppence murmured, pretending to inspect a tray of eclairs. Meanwhile, at the rear of the hall, Tommy was transforming into someone else entirely. A white jacket, borrowed from an inattentive waiter. A tray of glasses as prop. The disguise, though hardly foolproof, carried him through the staff corridor and into the restricted wing. He moved quickly but without haste, the old field rhythm returning as naturally as breath. Corridor, door, turn. He found the study by instinct more than map. Double doors, oak panelling, a faint smell of cigars and power. Locked. Naturally. He smiled thinly, produced a slim steel file from his pocket and knelt. "You've still got it, old man," he muttered. 2 minutes later, the lock surrendered with a soft click. The room was pure control, a study designed not for work, but for domination. Shelves of leather-bound volumes lined the walls. A vast desk commanded the center, its surface immaculate except for a crystal decanter and a single ashtray. Behind the desk, a painting of a ship at sea, its prow rising from waves that seemed about to swallow it. Tommy closed the doors quietly and crossed to the desk. He opened the top drawer. Files. Dozens of them, coded by initials and dates. Some stamped Bruges, some older still. He opened one and froze. Beresford, Thomas Edward. He stared. The neat, bureaucratic hand was impersonal, the ink faded but legible. Field operative suspected of compromise. Bruges, 1943. Possible double transmission. Recommendation, permanent removal from active duty. For a moment, the air left the room. He had read his own obituary once, after being reported missing in 41, but this was worse. This was a betrayal written in ink. He sank into the chair, mind racing. Who had filed this? Sir Gerald? Or someone higher? Someone who had needed a scapegoat? A movement outside the window caught his eye, the faint reflection of someone watching. He turned sharply, but saw only his own face in the glass, pale and taut. "Everyone's a traitor to someone." The voice came from behind him. Sir Gerald Martin stood in the doorway, smiling faintly, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of brandy. Tommy rose slowly. "I was hoping to have this conversation on my own terms." "But your terms," Martin said, "were never yours to begin with. You and your delightful wife have been dancing to my tune since Bruges." "Bruges was a long time ago." "Not long enough," Martin said smoothly. "Do sit down, Mr. Beresford. After all, you're part of the story." Tommy didn't sit. "You've been using those old files to blackmail people." "Influence, Mr. Beresford. Such an ugly word, blackmail. I merely remind them of history. Theirs, mine, yours." He gestured toward the open drawer, "including that little masterpiece of slander." Tommy's jaw tightened. "You wrote it?" "Not I. Your old superior, a man who found you inconveniently moral. I simply preserved it, along with so many other uncomfortable truths." He took a sip of brandy. "You see, we all played our parts in the war, but some of us learned to profit from the peace." Tommy's voice was quiet. "And when peace fails to pay enough, you revive the war." "Precisely. Operation Resurrection. A perfect phrase, don't you think? To resurrect the loyalties of the dead." "You mean to control the living?" Martin's smile deepened. "Control is such a vulgar word. Let's say, remind them who made them." The air between them vibrated with quiet menace. Tommy had faced worse men, but never one so serenely untroubled by conscience. "Where is my wife?" "Ah, yes, Mrs. Beresford." Martin set down his glass. "I rather admire her. Courage, wit, an unfortunate curiosity. She's safe, for now." "I'll take her word for that." "You'll take mine," Martin said softly. "Because if you don't, she'll be the one paying for your stubbornness. A pity. She's far more charming alive." Tommy's hand twitched, but he kept it in his pocket. "You've misjudged us, Martin. We're not the nostalgic sort." "On the contrary," Martin said, "you're exactly that. You live in your memories, the dashing young heroes, the codes, the danger. You came here because you couldn't bear the quiet." "And you built a world where quiet never comes," Tommy shot back. "You've turned memory into a weapon." Martin smiled. "Of course, memory always was the sharpest blade." Back in the ballroom, Tuppence's intuition was already sounding the alarm. She'd spotted Lydia Montrose slip away from the main crowd, heading toward the West Wing, and with her, two men who didn't belong among the gentry. Their movements had the clipped precision of professionals. Tuppence glanced at the auctioneer, whose hammer poised above a painting. She made a decision. Raising her voice, she said brightly, "Good heavens, is that the Vanishing Madonna, the one stolen from Bruges in '45? Heads turned. Whispers rippled. Lydia, halfway up the stairs, froze. The auctioneer blinked. "Madam?" "It must be," Tuppence insisted. "I'd know that expression anywhere." Panic flickered across faces. The perfect distraction. In seconds, murmurs became uproar. Guests crowded toward the stage, journalists' pens scratching furiously. While confusion blossomed, Tuppence darted into the corridor Lydia had vacated. In the study, Tommy had reached the end of his patience. "Suppose you're right," he said. "Suppose everyone's a traitor to someone. What about you, Martin? Who do you betray?" Martin's eyes glinted. "Everyone, eventually." Then came the sound, sharp, deliberate, the click of a safety catch. Tommy froze. From the shadowed corner stepped Lydia Montrose, pistol in hand, her expression unreadable. "Gerald," she said evenly, "you should have burned those files years ago." "Lydia, my dear, not you two." "Oh yes," she said. "Always me." Her hand trembled slightly, but the aim was steady. "You used me in Cairo. You used everyone else since. I've been waiting a long time for the resurrection to reach you." Martin's smile didn't waver. "Don't be absurd. You wouldn't risk prison for sentiment." "Not sentiment," she said. "Closure." Tommy took a cautious step back, voice calm. "Lydia, think, quiet," she snapped. "You, of all people, should appreciate revenge. On him, yes. Not with a bullet. That's too quick." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "You think I'm weak?" "I think," Tommy said quietly. "You've been running from the wrong ghost. You don't want to kill him. You want him to confess." A heartbeat of silence. Then Martin laughed, a low, amused sound that seemed to fill the room. "Confess? My dear Beresford, I've been confessing my whole life. People just call it charm." He stepped forward, too quickly. Lydia fired. The gunshot tore through the room, echoing like a hammer blow. Glass shattered. Papers fluttered from the desk like startled birds. Martin staggered, then realized with surprise that he wasn't the one bleeding. Lydia stared at the spreading stain across her own side, disbelief frozen on her face. The butler stood behind her, gun still raised, face impassive. "She was aiming at you, sir," he said tonelessly. Martin exhaled. "I'm aware." Lydia fell, the pistol slipping from her hand. Tuppence burst into the doorway just in time to see her crumple. "Tommy!" she cried. He turned, relief and shock colliding in his face. "You picked a splendid moment, old girl." "Did I?" she said breathlessly. "Because unless I'm mistaken, the entire house is in chaos." Martin smiled faintly. "Indeed. You two do have a gift for spectacle. But this," he gestured toward the desk, "changes nothing. The files remain, and so does your record, Mr. Beresford. You can't expose me without condemning yourself." Tommy stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "Perhaps not, but at least I'll know which side I'm on." He reached for the decanter, and in the same motion hurled it across the desk. It struck the lamp, which toppled, flames licking the oil-spread carpet. Martin shouted, leaping back. Smoke bloomed. Tuppence grabbed Tommy's arm. "Now!" They ran, the fire spreading behind them, papers curling into ash. Outside, guests screamed as alarms rang and chandeliers dimmed. The illusion of control burned with the draperies. At the top of the staircase, Tommy looked back once. Martin stood framed in the study doorway, firelight dancing on his face, calm, defiant, a man who believed even death might obey him. Tuppence tugged his sleeve. "Come on, before your name ends up in tomorrow's papers under heroic idiot dies in blaze." They slipped into the night as the first fire engines roared up the drive, sirens splitting the quiet countryside. They didn't stop driving until the hall's glow had vanished in the distance. The road stretched ahead, silver under moonlight. Tuppence broke the silence first. "You found the files?" "Some," Tommy said quietly. "Enough to know he wasn't lying. There's a record out there that says I was the traitor." She reached across, squeezing his hand. "Then we'll find who wrote it, and we'll bury it properly this time." He nodded, eyes still on the road. "Martin's right about one thing, though." "Oh?" "Everyone's a traitor to someone. Let's make sure we pick the right someone." The car disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the faint echo of sirens and the smell of smoke, the scent of resurrection gone wrong. It was the scream that broke the spell, sharp, disbelieving, and unmistakably real. The ballroom at Martin Hall moments ago, a swirl of laughter and pearls, dissolved into chaos. A gunshot's echo still hung like smoke in the crystal air, and guests froze mid-gesture, eyes wide, glasses suspended. Someone knocked over a candelabrum. Wax spilled like tears onto the carpet. Sir Gerald Martin stood by the fireplace, motionless but unharmed. On the parquet before him lay Lydia Montrose, the eternal intriguer, now shockingly mortal. Her black evening gown had folded beneath her like silk water. Her hand, still adorned with diamonds, clutched at air as if trying to seize the last word. "Get back!" shouted one of the footmen. "Stand clear!" But the command only bred hysteria. The women gasped, the men demanded explanations, and the orchestra, uncertain whether to flee or continue, produced one pitiful chord before silence took over. Tuppence, pressed against the wall near the stairwell, felt the familiar, icy clarity of danger return. She moved toward the fallen woman, but Tommy was already there, kneeling beside Lydia's still form. His hands were steady, his face grim. "She's gone," he said quietly, "shot clean through the lung." Sir Gerald turned to him, voice smooth but brittle. "A tragedy," he murmured. "Utterly unforeseen." "Unforeseen, perhaps," Tommy said, "but not accidental." Martin's eyes flicked to the servants gathering at the doors. "This is not the time for melodrama. Please see that Lady Aubrey and the others are taken to the orangery." His tone, cool and commanding, sliced through the panic like a conductor's baton. The guests obeyed. As the room emptied, Tuppence stepped forward. Lydia lay half-turned on her side now. Her eyes were open, still bright, though the life behind them was ebbing fast. "Lydia," Tuppence whispered, bending close. "Who fired?" The woman's lips trembled, shaping soundless words. Then, with effort, she reached up and gripped Tuppence's wrist. A scrap of paper, folded small, pressed into her palm. "Look," she breathed, "beneath the clock." Her fingers slackened, the diamonds went dull. The woman who had betrayed nations and men alike was suddenly nothing but silence and silk. Tommy rose, jaw set. "We'd better move before Martin's men tidy the evidence." "You're certain?" "Quite." He nodded toward the doorway, where the butler hovered, eyes watchful, hands clasped too tightly. "They'll say it was an accident. They'll make it so." Tuppence slipped the note into her sleeve. Then we'd best find out what she meant. The great hall was nearly deserted. Servants whispered in clusters. The guests had been shepherded into the orangery with brandy and reassurances. Only the grandfather clock stood its eternal watch, tall, solemn, its pendulum gleaming like a metronome of secrets. Tuppence approached it cautiously. "She said beneath, Tommy. If it's a compartment—" He knelt, running a hand along the carved base. The wood felt warm under his fingers from the nearby fire. "Here, a panel, spring-loaded." A click sounded. The panel eased open to reveal a shallow cavity lined in green felt. Inside lay the remnants of a dossier, edges scorched, papers fused together by heat. The top sheet, half legible, bore the faded heading Bruges, 1943, confidential. Tuppence reached for it, her fingers trembling. So, it wasn't destroyed after all. Or someone wanted us to think it was. They laid the fragments on a side table, piecing them together as best they could. Names appeared, initials, code names, Falcon, Lilac, Beowulf, and one in particular, circled in red pencil, Beresford, contact compromised. Tommy's throat tightened. Again. She met his eyes, framed twice over. Whoever did this wanted the legend to stick. A gust of air swept through the hall as a door opened. Instinctively, they pushed the papers back into the compartment and closed it. Footsteps echoed, Sir Gerald returning, flanked by two policemen in evening dress. He affected surprise at seeing them. "Ah, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. Still here? The inspector would prefer all guests remain until statements are taken." Tuppence smiled thinly. "We were admiring your clock. An impressive piece, 18th century." "A family heirloom," Martin said smoothly, "much like certain reputations." His eyes lingered on Tommy's face a moment longer than courtesy required. "Do be careful with history, Mrs. Beresford. It has sharp edges." Tommy took her arm. "Come along, darling. We'll give our statements and be off." An hour later, they were back on the road. The hall's lights receded behind them, swallowed by the countryside. Tuppence exhaled hard. "He knows we found something." "Undoubtedly." Tommy kept his eyes on the lane. "And I doubt he'll rest until it's back in his possession." She unfolded Lydia's note at last, smoothing it under the dashboard light. The paper was smeared with blood, but legible enough. Clock. File incomplete. True traitor's name erased. Seek initials E.M. Tuppence frowned. E.M. Not Martin's. His middle name's Alexander. Tommy nodded slowly. E.M. could be one of the others from the Bruges mission. Evans, Mallory. No, both dead. Or so we thought. The road curved toward the coast, the night thickening around them. Rain had begun in delicate, sideways strokes, misting the windscreen. Tuppence rubbed her temples. "Lydia died trying to tell us. Whoever E.M. is, they're still out there. Perhaps." She broke off as Tommy stiffened. In the mirror, two headlights had appeared. Distant, steady, too steady. "Following?" "Probably just coincidence," he said, though his tone made a liar of the words. He accelerated slightly. The lights matched his pace. "Coincidence, Tommy, doesn't have that good a sense of rhythm." The lane narrowed, flanked by hedgerows. The other car drew closer, its engine low and purposeful. The glare filled the rearview mirror. "Hold on," Tommy muttered, wrenching the wheel into a side turning. Gravel spat beneath the tyres as they shot onto the cliff road, a twisting ribbon above the sea. The lights followed. Tuppence gripped the dashboard. We can't outrun them on this road. Not planning to. Ahead, the bend curved sharply toward the coast. One wrong angle and the car would plunge into darkness. Tommy braked suddenly, slewing sideways across the lane. The pursuing vehicle, too close to adjust, swerved violently. Its tires screamed. Its headlights vanished in a spray of sparks and stone. A second later, the crash came, muffled, final. For a heartbeat, they sat in silence, hearts hammering, the engine ticking like a clock gone mad. "Did we?" Tuppence began. "I don't know," Tommy said grimly, "but we'd better see." He climbed out, rain needling his face, torch in hand. The other car lay 20 feet below, wedged among rocks at the cliff's base. Smoke rose from the bonnet, but the driver's door hung open, empty. Tuppence joined him, her voice low. "No body." "Which means our friend walks faster than he drives." They scrambled back to the car. Tommy checked the back seat, empty. Then his expression changed. Tuppence, the dossier. The hidden compartment in the floor of their motor, where he'd stowed the Bruges papers, gaped open. Empty. Tuppence stared. "But how? We locked the doors." "Someone was already in here before we left Martin Hall." Her hand flew to her mouth. "The valet. He took our coats. Oh, Tommy, we've been outplayed." He slammed the compartment shut, anger flaring. "So the evidence is gone again, back into the shadows where it began." "Not entirely," she said quietly, holding up the blood-stained note. "We still have EM. That's something." He looked at her, the familiar spark of defiance returning. "Yes, it's a start." Lightning flashed over the horizon, turning the sea momentarily silver. Tuppence shivered. "We'll need somewhere safe to think. Martin will assume we're dead." "Then let's not disappoint him. Yet," Tommy said. He started the engine. "There's an inn 2 miles up the road. We'll lie low until morning. Then we find out who the devil EM really is." They drove on through the storm, the road glistening like liquid glass. Behind them, the cliff's edge crumbled into the dark, swallowing whatever, or whoever, had pursued them. They reached the inn at dawn, the storm spent, the world washed to a pale grey calm. The innkeeper, a stooped man with more curiosity than suspicion, showed them to a room overlooking the harbour. Tuppence pulled the curtains aside. Fishing boats rocked gently below. Gulls screamed for breakfast. Ordinary life, blissfully ordinary, yet the weight of the night still clung to her. Tommy came up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You all right, old girl?" She nodded slowly. "It's odd. Lydia's dead, the dossier's gone, and we're back where we began, chasing ghosts." "Not ghosts," Tommy said. "Just the living pretending to be them." He poured coffee from the pot the innkeeper had left. "We'll track this EM down. Martin's too vain to hide his accomplices forever." Tuppence smiled faintly. "Remind me never to complain about village murders again. At least they come with tea breaks." Tommy raised his cup in salute. "To tea, then, and traitors yet to come." Outside, the sea glimmered under a new dawn, deceptively peaceful, as if nothing beneath its surface had ever conspired or betrayed. But the Beresfords knew better. Somewhere in the elegant wreckage of Martin Hall, the next move was already being planned. The fire crackled sullenly in the hearth, throwing long orange fingers across the walls of the cliffside cottage. Outside, the wind fretted at the eaves, but within, the air was thick with silence. Tuppence sat by the table, her arm in a makeshift sling, eyes fixed on the sea beyond the window, a restless, indifferent expanse. Tommy stood near the door, jacket torn, pacing in uneven circles. "We're alive," he said, as though repeating it might make it believable. "Alive and empty-handed." "You make it sound mutually exclusive," Tuppence murmured. He stopped pacing, ran a hand through his hair. "Tuppence, he's beaten us. Martin's alive, Lydia's dead, the dossier's gone, and my name's still sitting neatly in his files, marked traitor. If that isn't poetic injustice, I don't know what is." She poured 2 cups of tea, strong, bitter, more symbolic than soothing. "Poetic injustice has never stopped us before, and you're not a traitor. You're just inconveniently good at being framed." He gave a hollow laugh. "Charming. Perhaps we should add that to the family crest." Tuppence slid his cup toward him. "Drink your tea before you decide to retire from espionage altogether." He obeyed, though reluctantly. "I keep thinking, what if he's right? What if somewhere back in 43, some transmission, some word, I slipped, if that was enough to doom the others? Tommy," her tone cut clean through his spiral, "that's exactly what he wants you to think. Doubt is the best leash. You forget, I was there. If anyone slipped, it was the man now living under a borrowed conscience." He looked at her, the old spark returning despite himself. "You make betrayal sound like a hobby." "For some men," she said, "it is." They fell into silence again, the kind that gathers weight like fog. Outside, the sea hissed against the rocks, a slow, relentless heartbeat. At last, Tuppence rose, crossing to the small writing desk by the window. She opened the drawer and drew out a single folded sheet, Lydia Montrose's blood-stained note. "E.M.," she read softly. "We never found out who it was. But I've been thinking, what if it isn't a name at all?" Tommy frowned. "You mean initials that stand for something else?" "Exactly. E.M. could be Ex Machina, the Deus in the play, or it could be the old code designation for Martin's internal group. Echo Michael. Remember Bruges, those frequency lists?" He blinked. "Good Lord, you might be right. If that's true, then E.M. wasn't a person. It was the code name for Martin's faction itself." "The ghost," she said quietly. "Not a man, but a network, and he's kept it alive all these years." Tommy stared at her, realization dawning. "Then the ghost of our first enemy. It isn't symbolic. It's literal. A chain of betrayals still ticking away like a clock." "Exactly. And clocks," Tuppence added with dry precision, "can be stopped." They spent the next hour combing through what scraps they still had. Notes, names, fragments from memory. The more they pieced together, the clearer the picture became. Martin had used the post-war chaos to rebuild his network under a veneer of philanthropy. Operation Resurrection, indeed, the dead rising in tailored suits and government contracts. By the time dusk thickened into night, Tuppence was buttoning her coat. Tommy looked up sharply. "Where are you going?" "To finish what we started." "Absolutely not. You're half injured and he's half insane." "Then we're evenly matched," she said briskly. "He'll be at the cliffs. He always goes back to his victories." He stared at her. "You sound certain." "I am. Men like Martin can't bear endings they didn't author." Tommy sighed. "You'll get us both killed one day, you know." "Perhaps," she said, pulling on her gloves. "But not tonight." The road wound upward in silence, the car's headlights slicing through salt-thick air. Below, the sea murmured like a restless witness. The cottage lights faded behind them, replaced by the pale shimmer of moonlight on the cliffs. Half a mile ahead stood the Martin estate, or what was left of it. The fire from the previous night had gutted the upper floors. Now the ruins loomed like a skeleton against the horizon. Tommy parked by the gate, cut the engine. "Well," he said quietly, "here's to déjà vu." They walked the rest of the way. The grass was slick underfoot, the air heavy with salt and smoke. Somewhere in the dark, a gull screamed, not unlike the sound Lydia had made when the bullet struck. At the cliff's edge stood a solitary figure, Sir Gerald Martin. His coat flapped against the wind like the remnants of a flag. He didn't turn as they approached. "So," he said softly, "the ghosts return to their grave." "Fitting," Tuppence replied. "You built it for them, after all." He turned then, face drawn and pale, but eyes burning with an almost religious fervour. "You still don't understand. Ghosts don't die, Mrs. Beresford. They evolve. We were the architects of a new world, one run not by governments but by continuity. Someone must remember what the rest choose to forget." Tommy stepped closer. "You mean someone must profit from it?" Martin smiled faintly. "Profit is merely proof of foresight. Do you know what I sacrificed for that foresight? Friends, allies, even my own name. You both stood in Bruges when I faked my death. You thought the explosion finished me, but it freed me." Tuppence's voice was calm. "You betrayed the Allied Code Group. You handed over agents to the enemy for gold. Call it what it was." Martin's expression flickered. Pain, pride, something darker. You think betrayal is simple. It's arithmetic. A few names traded for a cause that outlived them. We built peace out of lies, Mrs. Beresford. Don't be sentimental about it. Tommy's fists clenched. You murdered good people. You destroyed lives, including ours. Martin tilted his head. Destroyed? No. You're here, aren't you? Still playing detective, still chasing ghosts because you can't face the quiet. You should thank me. Without me, you'd have faded into domestic oblivion years ago. Tuppence took a step forward, her eyes bright with fury. You've mistaken survival for purpose, Sir Gerald. There's a difference. He looked at her almost gently. You remind me of Lydia. Fierce, foolish, incurably loyal. She could never understand either. That's why I had to let her go. Let her go? Tommy said sharply. She died trying to expose you. Martin's smile returned, thin and tired. And what difference did it make? In a week, the papers will say she died in an accident. The network continues, unseen, undisturbed. Not this time, Tuppence said quietly. We still have her note. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. What note? Tommy stepped beside her. The one she gave us before she died. Look beneath the clock. The real files weren't destroyed, were they? You moved them. Here. Martin's gaze drifted toward the ruined house. If you had any sense, he murmured, you'd burn that note before it burns you. Then, with slow precision, he drew a pistol from his coat. The gesture was almost weary. I'm tired of tidy endings, he said. You've both had your moment. Let history finish the sentence. Tommy tensed, stepping instinctively in front of Tuppence. You won't pull that trigger. Martin raised the gun. Won't I? The wind surged, howling across the cliffs, drowning the world in sound. For a moment, no one moved. Then, a single gunshot. Sharp, echoing, final. Martin staggered. Surprise etched itself across his face like a crack through marble. He looked down at the dark bloom spreading across his chest, then slowly toward the source of the shot. Albert stood 10 paces away, revolver steady, expression grim. His overcoat flapped like a banner in the wind. Sorry, sir, he said, with the dry understatement of a man who had waited too long to speak. Couldn't let you shoot my friends. Martin swayed, then laughed, a short, bitter sound. Loyalty, he whispered. How quaint. His knees buckled. He fell without grace, the pistol tumbling from his grasp. The wind took the last of his words and carried them into the sea. They buried him where he fell, or rather, they watched as the tide began the work for them. By the time Albert returned with a spade from the car, the sea had already claimed the edge of the cliff, washing over footprints, erasing history with perfect indifference. Tuppence stood apart, coat drawn tight around her shoulders. It's strange, she said softly. He wanted immortality, and now he'll have it, as an unmarked story in the waves. Tommy nodded, weary. Poetic in its way. He was always fond of grand gestures. Albert joined them, wiping his hands. The police will find what's left soon enough. What'll we tell them? The truth, Tuppence said, or at least the version that hurts no one living. Albert gave her a look somewhere between admiration and pity. You two never did know when to stop. Tommy smiled faintly. If we ever did, we'd be bored to death. Albert chuckled. A fair point. Still, I'll sleep easier knowing that Ghost won't be haunting anyone else. He headed back toward the car. The Beresfords lingered a moment longer, watching the sea swallow the last trace of Sir Gerald Martin. Tuppence slipped her hand into Tommy's. Do you think we've finally put it to rest? He considered. Ghosts don't rest, Tuppence. They just wait until someone digs them up again. Then let's hope no one else is foolish enough to go looking. He smiled. Except us, of course. She sighed. Except us. They turned away from the cliff's edge as dawn began to stain the horizon pink, the faint promise of peace, or at least of breakfast. Behind them, the sea rolled on, indifferent to the dead, the living, and the thin, wavering line between them. The fire had burned low, the coals glowing like watchful eyes in the hearth. Outside the cottage, dawn pressed softly against the curtains, but neither of the Beresfords stirred to greet it. The night's wind had spent itself, leaving a silence that was almost reverent. Tuppence sat curled in her armchair, knees drawn up, the edges of a tartan shawl brushing her slippers. Across from her, Tommy leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the flames with a gaze that saw far beyond them. Between them on the rug lay a small stack of papers, brittle, brown-edged, bound once by secrecy and blood. No reporters had come, no police statements were taken. By morning, the newspapers would carry only a brief note. Local philanthropist Sir Gerald Martin dies tragically in fall from cliff. Authorities rule accident. The rest would vanish into official archives, sealed by the same invisible hands that had built the lie in the first place. "Well," Tuppence said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "It's over." Tommy gave a small, humourless smile. "Is it?" She looked at him, the faintest crease of irritation softening into affection. "You can't keep fighting phantoms, Tommy. Even ghosts get bored of being chased." He poked at the fire with the brass poker, sparks leaping like startled memories. "The trouble with ghosts," he said, "is that they don't know they're dead." For a moment, they both watched the flames. Then Tuppence leaned forward and took the top sheet of the dossier. "We ought to finish it," she murmured, "before someone else decides to resurrect the story." He nodded. "Go on then. I'll witness the execution." One by one, she fed the pages to the fire. The edges curled, ink dissolving into orange and blue. Names, codes, betrayals, all devoured by the quiet hunger of flame. The final fragment bore a single word written in faded pencil: resurrection. She hesitated, then dropped it in. The fire flared briefly and then subsided, leaving only ash and heat. Tommy sat back with a sigh. Do you suppose Martin ever believed in what he was doing, or was it just power dressed up in patriotism? Tuppence considered. "I think he believed in himself. That's the most dangerous faith of all." He smiled faintly. "You sound like Mrs. Bloxby." "Thank you, I think." The kettle on the hob began to murmur, the faint hiss of ordinary life intruding on extraordinary memory. Tuppence rose and crossed the small kitchen, filling their cups as she spoke. "Do you remember Bruges, that morning by the canal, before everything went wrong?" He chuckled. "I remember you threatening to shoot the lock if it didn't open faster." "I was impatient," she said with mock dignity. "War doesn't suit waiting." She brought him a cup and sat again. The air between them softened, heavy with shared ghosts. "They were all so young," she said quietly. "Even Gerald, before he turned into a sermon on treachery. Sometimes I think we've spent half our lives tidying up after men who believed they were the only clever ones in the room." "And doing it better," Tommy added. She smiled, naturally. A comfortable silence settled, broken only by the ticking of the old mantel clock, the same clock that had once concealed Martin's secrets. It seemed almost symbolic now, steady and unremarkable, measuring time instead of hiding it. At length, Tuppence reached down to gather the remaining ashes into the hearth tray. As she did, something pale caught her eye, a small rectangle of paper that had not burned. She picked it up carefully. It was a photograph, edges singed but image intact. 3 figures stood in sunlight: Tommy, herself, and another man whose face was half turned toward the camera. All wore wartime uniforms, smiles bright and unaware. Behind them, a stone wall and the faint curve of a bridge, Bruges unmistakably. Tuppence stared for a long moment. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose even fire has its conscience." Tommy leaned closer. "That was taken the week before the Bruges mission. I'd forgotten we even had a camera then." She traced the third man's blurred outline with her thumb. "Do you remember him?" Tommy frowned. "No, at least not clearly. He could be one of Martin's lieutenants, or perhaps one of ours." "Perhaps," she said, "but I rather think he's better off unnamed." She hesitated, then held the photograph over the fire. The flames reached for it greedily, tongues curling up around the image. Yet as the paper began to darken, she drew it back. Tommy watched her. "Changed your mind?" "Maybe." She turned the photograph over and slipped it into the drawer of the writing desk. "Some memories deserve to stay inconvenient." He chuckled softly. "You're a sentimentalist, Mrs. Beresford." "And you," she retorted, "are an optimist disguised as a cynic. Between us, we make a tolerable realist." Tommy set down his cup and stood, stretching stiffly. "So, the government buries the case, Martin's gone to his judgment, Lydia's a headline for one night only, and we're left to contemplate moral ambiguity over tea. Tuppence smiled faintly. Sounds like peace to me. He looked toward the window, where the first light of morning crept across the sea. Peace never lasts. Someone will dig it up again, a file, a name, a photograph, and the ghosts will come tapping for their encore. She joined him at the window, resting a hand on his arm. Then we'll take our bows when they do. He turned to her, eyes crinkling at the corners. You'd do it all again, wouldn't you? Of course, she said, but I'd pack more sandwiches. He laughed, a quiet, genuine sound that warmed the room more than the fire. For a while they stood together in companionable silence, watching the horizon pale into day. Tuppence spoke at last, her voice barely above the whisper of the sea outside. Do you ever think we were different people then, the ones in that photograph? Tommy shook his head. Same people, just with better posture. She elbowed him gently, smiling, and less arthritis. The humour faded into something tender. He took her hand. We've buried enough ghosts, Tuppence. Let's not become them ourselves. She squeezed his fingers. Agreed. But if we do, let's at least haunt interesting people. He grinned. Deal. They turned back toward the hearth. The last of the ashes had cooled, grey and soft as dust. The mantel clock struck the hour, a calm, domestic sound. Somewhere far off a gull cried, the world returning to itself. Tuppence picked up the poker and stirred the coals, watching the faint red glow flare and fade. Strange, she murmured, how something can be gone and yet not finished. Tommy nodded. That's memory for you. She looked at him, eyes bright in the firelight. And us? He smiled, the old mischief flickering through. Ghosts don't vanish, old girl. They wait for an encore. Tuppence laughed softly. Then heaven help the audience. He raised his cup in mock salute. To ghosts, ours, theirs, and all the ones still waiting for curtain call. She clinked her cup against his. To encore performances, then. The fire sighed, the clock ticked, and the sea beyond the window kept its eternal rhythm. In the quiet cottage on the cliff, two old spies sat side by side, not triumphant, not tragic, merely enduring, as the world turned toward another day that would forget them, and another night that never quite would. The bookshop on the corner of Hampstead High Street was one of those places where dust had tenure and time moved at the pace of a careful reader. The bell above the door gave a polite, tired jingle as Tommy Beresford pushed it open. He was carrying a newspaper under his arm and wearing the mild, slightly mischievous look of a man who has already read something he isn't supposed to. Tuppence followed, shaking off her umbrella. I still don't see why we had to come in person, she said. If it's just a book review, we could have read it at home. It's not a review, old girl, Tommy said, lowering his voice as they passed the counter. It's a revelation. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles permanently half-mast on his nose, looked up from unpacking a crate. Ah, you're in luck, he said. Just had another batch in. Flying off the shelves, this one. He reached under the counter and produced a slender hardback wrapped in cream dust jacket paper. The title was printed in stark black letters, The Ghost of Their First Enemy. Tuppence blinked. Oh, how original, she said dryly. What is it? Some dreadful pot-boiler? Tommy took the book, thumbing through the pages. His brow furrowed. Not exactly. She watched his expression shift, amusement, disbelief, and then a quiet, tightening alarm. Tommy? He handed it to her. Read the first page. The dedication was simple. To those who fight ghosts because they cannot bear silence. And then the first line. They thought Bruges was finished, but history never stays buried. Tuppence's heart gave a small, traitorous leap. She turned another page, and there it was. Names, places, incidents. The cliff, Martin Hall, even Lydia Montrose's last whispered words. Every detail rendered with an intimacy that could not have come from a stranger. She looked up sharply. This is impossible, Tommy nodded. And yet there it is, 3 and 6pence at your nearest bookshop. They bought a copy and left without another word. Back at the cottage, the day stretched pale and thin against the sea. The fire was out, the teapot had gone cold. Tuppence sat at the writing desk while Tommy paced behind her, the book open between them. It's us, she said finally, every word of it. The conversations, the cliff, even Albert's shot, it's all there. He poured 2 fresh cups of tea, handed one to her. Someone's been doing their homework. She frowned, tapping the book's spine. But who? The only people who knew the full story were the 3 of us. And Albert wouldn't write a novel. His spelling's still under government review. Tommy chuckled faintly. Maybe it's a journalist, or some ghostwriter who got wind of things. Ghostwriter, she repeated dryly. Rather apt. He stopped pacing, gaze thoughtful. It's not just the story, though. Listen to this. He read aloud from the final page. The traitor fell, but the conscience of the war did not. Every spy leaves a reflection behind, and every reflection eventually walks back into the light. Tuppence folded her arms. That sounds like Martin. Or someone who knew him very well. They reached the end together. The final line read, "History always rewrites itself." Tommy exhaled. Comforting thought. But she was still staring at the page, her finger resting on the corner. "Wait," she said softly. "There's more." At the bottom, in smaller type, a postscript. For TB, with affection from Bruges. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hiss of the sea against the rocks outside. Then Tuppence whispered, "It can't be." Tommy's face had gone very still. "Unless it can." She shut the book gently, as if afraid to disturb the words. "He died, Tommy. We saw the body fall. The sea took him." "The sea," Tommy said, "has always been an unreliable witness." They sat in silence, each chasing their own thoughts through the maze of memory. At last Tuppence said, "If Martin survived, he's had help. Someone printed this. Someone distributed it." Tommy nodded slowly. "Someone who wants us to know he's still out there. Or wants us to think so." "That's worse," he said grimly. "At least a live ghost you can shoot." She smiled faintly. "And what would you do if he did come back?" "Oh, the usual," he said. "Tea first, recriminations later." Her laughter came, soft but genuine. "You really haven't changed." "Neither have you," he said. "You're still the only woman I know who can turn a death threat into a dinner topic." Tuppence rose, crossed to the window. The sky was bruised with dusk, the kind that makes the sea look infinite and unknowable. She watched a gull trace the wind, its wings sharp against the fading light. "It's funny," she said quietly. "We've spent our lives solving mysteries, but perhaps the best ones aren't meant to be solved." Tommy joined her, hands in his pockets. "Meaning?" "Meaning some truths are like that tide out there. They retreat, they return, but they never quite disappear. You just learn to live with the sound." He studied her profile in the half-light. "You're not frightened, are you?" She shook her head. "No, just aware. If he's alive, let him write his ghost stories. We've had ours," he smiled. "Spoken like a woman who knows how to outlive her enemies." She turned to him, eyes bright with the same defiance that had carried them through half a century of intrigue. "And her husband," she teased. He bowed slightly. "Touché." Later they walked down to the seafront. The air was cool and salted, the promenade nearly empty except for a child chasing a paper boat along the puddles. The horizon was fading from gold to violet, and the sea whispered its endless monologue. Tommy carried the book under his arm. "You know," he said, "I rather like the title, The Ghost of Their First Enemy. Has a ring to it." Tuppence looked at him sidelong. "It's not bad," she admitted, "though it's missing something." "What's that?" "A sequel." He laughed. "Heaven forbid. We're too old for sequels." "Speak for yourself," she said. "I've still got one good adventure left in me." "Let's save it for the next war." "Tommy!" All right," he grinned. "No more wars, only mysteries." They stopped at the railing, the tide lapping below, the world painted in twilight. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind tugged at her scarf. He reached out and steadied it, his hand finding hers in the same motion. "You know," he said softly, "it's a strange thing, to have lived long enough to see your own story in print." Tuppence smiled, but her voice was distant. "Stories have their uses. They make us immortal, in the wrong sort of way." He looked at her. "Regret it?" "Not a line," she said. Then, after a pause, "But I do wonder who's writing the next chapter." The waves rose and fell, their rhythm steady as memory. Behind them, the lamps along the promenade began to glow, small, steadfast lights against the dusk. Tommy squeezed her hand. "Whoever it is," he said, "they'll have a hard act to follow." She leaned against him, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Let's hope they don't try." The tide climbed higher, murmuring its secrets to the shore. Somewhere unseen, a bell tolled from the harbour. The world, as always, went on, forgetting names, softening edges, rewriting itself as history does. But on that quiet seafront, two figures stood together, unforgotten to each other, partners still, watching the tide rise, holding hands against the years, and smiling into the mystery that refused to end.